Yeah, I'm going to talk about this project that I worked on during my time at NYU. It's called the Pedestrian Crossing Distance Project. And yeah, it started out as part of my capstone during my data science degree, and then kind of became a little bit more than that. And really what I want to talk about today is, given that this is Transit Techies, a little bit about the technical work that went into making this project work. Yeah, so let's get into it. Before I do though, these are my collaborators. Immensely grateful to them. Professor Leifer, I don't know if she's here actually. There she is. Yeah, she's a professor here at NYU. She kind of like masterminded this whole thing. Professor Moran, he was a postdoc at NYU while we were working on this project. Now he's a professor at San Jose State University. He is actively taking PhD students, by the way, in case anyone wants to go work there. And then my collaborator on this project, also Tony Chun, he was also doing this capstone with me. He's currently working at Himalaya, which is a podcast company based in Shanghai. So let's get into like why this project got started in the first place. I'm sure a lot of you have seen crosswalks that look like this in the past. This is one from Dallas, Fort Worth area. On the right is one from Irvine. These are both like over 80 feet long. And like what goes through your mind when you see these and you're trying to cross the street, right? Like you look at this and you go, well, crap, I need to like somehow make it across. I need to get the timing to, avoid hitting a car. I need to make sure that when the walk sign goes on, and usually gives me like 30 to 40 seconds, I can actually make it across the street. Now, that's all fine for us, most of us. But imagine you also have mobility restrictions. You have a walker or a cane or a wheelchair. And this becomes all of a sudden like a massive nightmare. And you basically can't get anywhere, especially when your city is covered in these. You don't really know what to do. And so that's why, over the last 10 years, I think this is a really tragic stat. We've actually seen a 40-year high in the number of people struck and killed, while trying to basically cross the street. There's a lot of like correlating factors here, by the way. Like when you have wider crosswalks, you also typically have wider lanes, which encourages people to drive faster than the speed limit, which means that the energy involved in a collision is much higher. Like think back to high school physics, velocity squared, right? So like every incremental increase in your velocity basically doubles the amount of energy, that hits the body during a collision. So this is really grim. And the worst part about this is, like I mentioned earlier, this impacts people like senior citizens most. This is a quote from Alberto Lau. He was interviewed by the New York Times. He's from San Diego, essentially talking about how this like really cordons off his ability to explore his own city. And the thing about San Diego is like, it is relatively walkable by most metrics, yet we still kind of see these issues happen, even in cities that are making really strong efforts in like densification and walkability. There's typically these like large arterials that separate these walkable neighborhoods, and these arterials essentially force you into this jail that's like the streets that you're surrounded by. The thing is, we actually kind of know the answer to this problem, and I'm sure a lot of you do already, which is every major street design guide that's been published since that stat went out in 2022 talks about how your main goal when designing a street needs to include keeping your crossing distances as short as possible. You can do this on existing streets really easily. You can do things like add bulb outs, which are, I think a lot of you have seen them actually in downtown Brooklyn. You essentially just extend the curb a little bit into the street. This has the effect of reducing the size of the crosswalk a little bit. Another thing you can do is you can add median dividers, you can add refuge islands, which are essentially places for people to stop and take a break in the middle of a crossing. And these are really helpful when your crossing distance is really large, like over 80 feet. So then the question becomes, okay, we know what to do. We know why we need to do it. Why can't we do it yet? These are real draft drawings from San Francisco. And these are basically the only source of truth that exists today on exactly the length of crosswalks. You can't even see them from where you all are sitting, but like the measurements are here. And in the case of maps that are as old as from 1950, which still have to be updated today, by the way, even though they're digitized, someone has to go in and like pull it out of the archives and write by hand any updates that are being made. They look like that, and like you can't read anything in that, right? So there is really no way for us to like sit down, take all of these documents and try to figure out the length of crossing distances nationwide in a way that is scalable or accurate in any way, shape, or form. And so that's where we get to with this project, which is essentially the top line goal. Can we measure every single pedestrian crossing in the US accurately? The methodology that we come out to solve this problem, I won't get into too much today, because the purpose of this talk is to talk about why this works, not why we landed up with this specific methodology. But just to summarize, what we ended up doing was essentially using two different data sources, Google Maps and OpenStreetMap. From Google Maps, we pulled satellite tiles of street intersections. From OpenStreetMap, we pulled actual crosswalks, so like crossings that people have reported on OpenStreetMap. We then do, essentially we take the satellite images, we put them through a surface segmentation model. This is based on Meta's segment anything model to essentially identify what sort of portions of the satellite image people can't drive on. So the drivable and the non-drivable areas. We then take the crosswalks from OpenStreetMap and we essentially projection map them across the drivable zones that the segment anything model determined. And what we end up with is essentially a really good curb to curb mapping of where the crosswalk actually lies. So like kind of, this is essentially the danger zone. So when a pedestrian is in this zone, they are, in a danger zone where they can potentially be hit by a car. We then take this and we scale it up across the nation, and we do it for every single crosswalk that we can find on OpenStreetMap, every single satellite tile we can find on Google Maps. So back to the top line goal, right, of measuring every pedestrian crossing in the US accurately. This sort of betrays two different design goals that we have. The first one is on coverage, right, measuring every single one. So how high can we get the coverage across the US? The second design goal is obviously on accuracy, like how accurate can we get this to some manual ground truth of crossing distances. And the benefit here is actually my collaborators, Professor Leifer and Professor Moran, they actually went through before we did this study, and they manually measured every single crossing distance in SF and Irvine. So we had that as a ground truth to sort of evaluate how good this pipeline is. On the last note, just on scoping, we ended up doing the 100 largest US cities by population, but the idea behind making this pipeline very modular is that anyone can take it and apply it to any other city that you wanted to in North America, provided, of course, you have the data to do so. So yeah, let's get into design goal one on improving the coverage of that pipeline specifically. I'm going to sort this talk into essentially a series of 5 challenges. 3 of the challenges will be on coverage, 2 of the challenges will be on accuracy. So challenge number 1 was like, how do we even get these crosswalks in the first place? We're using some tools that some of you may be familiar with, obviously OpenStreetMap. The representation we're using for this data is NetworkX, which is a Python library that allows you to represent graphs, so like nodes and edges. A lot of you might be familiar with OSMNX, created by Jeff Boeing at USC. It's essentially a way to query OpenStreetMap into NetworkX compatible graphs. So that for every feature that's available on a map, you get either a node or an edge. Now that's really important because there are at least 14 different representations that I know of for how to represent a crosswalk in OpenStreetMap. The large reason why this discrepancy exists, by the way, is because OpenStreetMap is kind of like Wikipedia, but for maps. And so contributors can kind of decide how they want to represent a crosswalk. Oftentimes what we find is someone will go into a part of a city or like a neighborhood, represent a crosswalk however they see fit, and then someone else will come on top of that and be like, I don't actually like that representation, let me redo it, but let me just add duplicates. So one thing that we might see sometimes is like this example over here, where we end up with a node that someone represented for a crosswalk, but then someone else came in a few months later and represented it as an edge. These are actually corresponding to the same crosswalk, but they're not, like they're completely independent of each other. So we have to do things like merge those. Other examples we see are this thing we call super crosswalks, which are entire crosswalk complexes that were represented as essentially one crosswalk object. They were given one OpenStreetMap ID, so that needs to now be separated. And then a third one, which was particularly gnarly, was sort of this like over a median divider example where you have 3 nodes and 2 edges, where the 2 edges exist on 2 different lanes of traffic that are going on a road, and the 3 nodes are like the sidewalk ends and then the refuge island that's in the middle. And oftentimes, actually, because of the way that streets are designed, and there's obviously immense variance in how streets are designed across the US, those might not necessarily be collinear sometimes, and like drastically so, like especially at 5-point intersections where you have refuge islands as well. And you end up with these like V-shaped looking crosswalks that are all represented with the same OSM ID. So now you can't even deduplicate them using like angle measurements. And so, yeah, there's a lot of these, as you can imagine, across these 100 cities that we looked at. So how do we solve this? Well, the main thing is we need to design like a query that can go and find all of these in OpenStreetMap, which took some time. And then we need to do some aggressive deduplication and merging. So like one of the things we needed to do was take the node representations and grow them into lines by mapping them to the drive lines that they were on. So like take the traffic lane that they were on, find the perpendicularity and then like expand that into a line. Another thing that we needed to do was take the super crosswalks and just break them up, basically. So ensure that every edge has exactly 2 endpoints. Another thing was like to map each line to its closest drive edge. The reason you need to do this sometimes is because it allows you to merge across medians, which is important. And that goes to the fourth thing, which is to deduplicate any overlap that exists across medians. Because of course, if you have a crosswalk that goes through 2 different lanes of traffic, like a northbound and a southbound, it's actually the same crosswalk, and you want to represent it as such. So now to challenge 2. Now we have the crosswalks at this point. Now we need to find the images. Just doing some back of napkin math as to the amount of images we needed to pull for this project. It's around 2.74 million images. It turns out the Google Maps tile server is actually scrapable with no auth. I don't know if they've patched this yet, but this is true. You can still do that. It comes out to scraping around 430 terabytes off of Google Maps' tile server, which is a lot more data than we have space to store. At rest, so essentially when we ended up scraping this, what we ended up doing was compression on the fly. So every time you scrape a tile, you compress it immediately. So you never actually have to store 430 terabytes of data. You actually only have to store like 8.2 terabytes because you can just compress it using like standard image compression techniques. And it's enough that you don't lose a lot of fidelity when you get into the actual like model inferencing and model training stages. Another thing that was really important that we learned here, and for any of you who have worked with satellite imagery, you probably know this. Satellite images kind of have a pyramidal structure to them. So the highest zoom level is global, that's zoom level 0. And then every subsequent zoom level you get down below that, you take the prior zoom level and you cut it into 4 quadrants. So zoom level 1 has 4 quadrants, zoom level 2 has 16, so on and so forth. For this project, we started at around zoom level 21 or zoom level 20. But one thing we learned was that the higher the latitudes you go to, actually a lot of the lower zoom levels aren't even available because the Landsat satellites that Google Maps uses, they don't get high enough in their orbits to go that low in terms of the zoom levels. And so you actually have to hop up a zoom level. And in the case of Anchorage in Alaska, actually, it was such a high latitude that we didn't actually even have high resolution satellite imagery from Anchorage. I'm sure we could get it through private means through like Planet Labs or something, but that would be way too expensive. Google Maps doesn't have high resolution stuff for Anchorage, unfortunately. Anchorage and strangely enough, actually Jacksonville, but I'll get to that later. I don't know what's wrong with Jacksonville. So this is the pipeline we designed to get these images out of Google Maps. This was at least the first version we did. We're very thankful to Modal. They're a startup based out of New York. They do like serverless compute. Basically, imagine if like AWS started with AWS Lambda. And they gave us around $2,000 to work on this project. So we're extremely grateful to them for their grant. This was the first version of this. So essentially what we had was like a batch of workers that was doing like getting the images off of the Google Maps tile server. It was going to get sent back to a driver node. And then that driver node was going to send it to these batching like committer nodes. These committer nodes were then going to commit the, like do the actual compression and then commit the actual images to disk. The disk was like a standard like distributed file system kind of disk. The problem that you'll learn, and for those of you who work in distributed systems, this was probably immediately clear looking at this diagram, is your bottleneck is actually your task dispatcher. You're sending all 430 terabytes of data through a single node. That's never going to work. We learned this after the first few runs because what ends up happening is your batchers get stuck in a queue, which means that your task dispatchers get stuck with terabytes on terabytes of images, which means that your memory size balloons to the point where you like no longer can run this. And what we realized was ultimately this was going to cost us around $10 to $60 per city just in storage costs. At 100 cities, that's like not feasible. We'd burn through our grant very, very quickly. So we had to redesign this. What we ended up going with was kind of a more fan-out architecture. I'll explain what's going on here. We have a driver node that stays completely independent of any sort of data. We have batch process coordinates nodes, which are responsible both for delegating out the actual image fetching to separate fan-out nodes. They then come back with the image, and then the batching coordinate worker is the one that actually does the committing to the volume. So this way, we bypass using a single node as a bottleneck entirely. So as you can see on the usage diagram, this like flattened our usage by around 85%. We're now able to do every city in basically less than $15 with an average of around $3 per city. So this saved us a ton of money when we did it this way. And what you end up storing essentially on these batch process coordinates executors is around 110 gigabytes because we also let the get image from coordinate workers do the actual compression on the fly. So this actually like just a little bit of more like smart design ended up saving us a ton of money over here. Yeah, then we'll get to design goal number 2, which was on accuracy. So now we have, at this point, we have the ingredients to begin our process, right? We have the crosswalks, we have the satellite images. Now we need to actually do inference and training on the satellite images, and then we need to, actually map them to the crosswalks. So to do this, we ended up using SAM2, or Segment Anything model. This is a model created by Meta. It's a multimodal vision and image model, which is essentially able to do what's called zero-shot segmentation of visual data. So this means that it's trained to essentially pick out features in images that it's never seen before. This works to some degree. It's actually not that good on satellite images is what we learned. And so we had to do a lot of training to make it a lot better. In the AI world, this is called fine tuning. So we take an existing model, we essentially place a matrix on top of it, and then we just train the matrix to learn task-specific representations. In our case, the representation we're trying to learn is, where are the drive boundaries and non-drivable regions in a satellite image? Now, we needed data to do this fine-tuning, right? And at this point, like I mentioned earlier, we had around 8.2 terabytes of data that was sitting unlabeled. So how do we go through that and determine what we want to label? The idea here was to use entropy-based sorting. So looking at our data, the top row over here sort of shows images from our satellite fetcher that have essentially high image entropy, which means that there's a lot of information content in the pixels of the image. On the lower hand, you can see images that have low entropy. So like looking at this immediately, you can kind of determine, it makes a lot more sense to label the images in the top row than it does in the bottom row. The bottom row has not a lot of information available to fine tune a model with. The top one does. This is called curriculum training, where you essentially, rather than giving the model a bunch of random data, you intensely curate the data that you give to the model so that it can learn the most amount of information in the least amount of time. From an information theory standpoint, this makes a lot of sense because you're essentially giving the model as much entropy as possible, like as much bytes encoded in the data so that it can train itself most efficiently. We did this by doing hand labeling for 193 images and then did augmentation, which is just like flipping and rotating the image to produce an image data set of almost 6,000 images that we ended up doing the fine-tuning pipeline on. Fine-tuning, by the way, I don't really talk about it here, but fine-tuning took around 9 to 12 hours per run. This is what hand labeling looks like. We used a platform called RoboFlow to do this. We basically just put all the satellite images that we wanted to hand a label into this platform, and we sat down and we just hand drew sort of polygons around what are the drivable and the non-drivable regions. So in this case, you can see, for example, we have like a non-drivable refuge island in the middle of the crosswalk, in addition to, of course, the areas where the buildings lie and the sidewalks lie in the corners of the image. We did this for 193 images, like I mentioned, and that's what gave us our training data set. Now, out of this, we get a really good model that's like decent most of the time at segmenting out the non-drivable regions. But it's not perfect, which is what leads us to challenge number 4, which is guardrailing. There are largely 2 error modes that this model now has. There is essentially false positives and false negatives. A false positive is when the model segments a patch of pavement that is supposed to be drivable, but it classifies it as non-drivable. What this can lead to is often underestimation. So we can look at a crosswalk here. If there's extra patches that have been classified, then the crosswalk that will result out of that patch will be an underestimation of the real crosswalk. That's like the curb-to-curb measurement. The second error mode that you reach up is false negatives, where it forgets to classify a legitimate non-drivable zone, and it just completely forgets it altogether. So this can lead to overestimation, as you can see on the right. What this basically means is that when we end up mapping the crosswalk down to the drivable sections on the pavement, it ends up kind of going past it and into the crosswalks and oftentimes into buildings. So we want to avoid both of these situations. For the underestimation case, what we ended up doing was this thing called driveline filtering. Essentially, we realized that for every satellite image, we actually know where the traffic lanes are already because that comes from OpenStreetMap. We can assign buffers around that area and just say that if there is a patch that was in the street, we just kick it out of our data set entirely. Another thing we can do, because Segment Anything model supports doing something called negative point prompting, where you can essentially assign points on an image and say, I know for sure this is not what I'm looking for. So again, because we have the streets, we can just point at the street and say, I know that there should not be any patches in the street. And then we just give that to the model, and the model doesn't classify the streets anymore. For false negatives, what we ended up doing here was something we called building footprint imputation. I think actually the best way to describe this is on the next slide. So imagine this image we have over here. the model forgets to segment this one in the top left. What we end up doing is we actually just go back to OpenStreetMap and we get the building footprints, which are a feature that's available. We then just add those as polygons, and we know that they're non-drivable because obviously they're buildings. So we just put them as segmented areas in the image. And this gives us a really good bound because like imagine here, we're trying to measure this crosswalk. We definitely get an overestimation where this crosswalk would get measured into the curb. But with the polygons, when we measure it, it'll probably hit the polygon and that'll at least stop it. So we can somehow guardrail on overestimations that way. For underestimations, it's kind of similar. We have false positives like you can see over there, and we can just filter them out by taking a street center line, attaching a buffer on either side and essentially saying if it's in that buffer, then it's definitely drivable. Now, after guardrailing, after fine tuning, after all of the training that we did, we ended up with some really good segmentations. And there's a lot of like really cool emergent intelligence that happened here. So these are real examples of segmentation that was done by the model after all the fine tuning and the guardrailing and all of that. What you can notice here is like it's invariant to shadows, which actually took a lot of time because shadows provide a lot of contrast in satellite imagery. And being able to recognize that this is not actually a building or a curb, but it's actually a shadow, that was really impressive. Another one that I thought was really impressive was it has the ability to look behind trees. So tree cover was a really big challenge because oftentimes trees cover sidewalks. It's actually able to infer on the top right over there, it's able to infer the outline of the curb based on everything else around it, even though a tree is hiding the curb, which I thought was really, really cool. Another thing it's able to do is filter out and like look past parking lots. So parking lots are often built out of the same asphalt that streets are built off of. And so in early iterations, we were finding that it classifies parking lots as drivable areas. We were able to solve that with some fine tuning. So yeah, once again, now we have segmented images, we have our crosswalks. Now it's time to map them together to actually get our real crosswalks. So here's what this kind of looks like. Imagine we have a crosswalk, we have a segmented image. Essentially what we're gonna do is we're gonna start by growing the sidewalk until it hits one of the segmented areas. So it hits one, we cut it there. We then keep going, it hits this side, we cut it there. And this is iterative. So we do this like 4 or 5 times for every crosswalk. And then eventually when we have cut both endpoints, we then cut it anywhere in the middle where it intersects with anything. So this way we can take, once again, something that was kind of naive, like reported by someone on OpenStreetMap, and we can get like a highly accurate curb to curb measurement. This is invariant to like refuge islands or any breaks in the crosswalk or anything like that as well. So yeah, back to this pipeline. Now we can kind of see how these 5 different challenges that we had to solve, like make this pipeline very scalable and very robust. By the time we were done with all of this, applying it to all 100 cities, we ended up with almost 800,000 crosswalks nationwide. And an average error in SF that we measured was around 2 feet and 3 inches. So we were within 2 feet and 3 inches in terms of mean measurement error when measuring some of these crosswalks. This is a really good way to summarize it. So this is a histogram of crosswalk lengths. The x-axis is the length in feet in San Francisco. The purple is everything that my collaborators like manually annotated, like by hand. They looked at every single satellite image and they measured out every single crosswalk. So that's like a golden ground truth. The green line is the automated measurement that we were able to find. And you can see that there's pretty good similarity here. And actually, if you do the pairwise measurements, that's where it comes down to like around 2 feet, 3 inches of average error. So now let's look at some crosswalks. We did a lot of work to get up to this point. Now we can just kind of look at pictures and sort of, yeah. This is San Diego. This was really popular. This was really interesting because this was an unmarked crosswalk. And it also had like really broken pavement, which tends to confuse the model sometimes. Philadelphia, this is like a much more complex crosswalk. I was really impressed by this one from Baltimore because it was actually a roundabout and it was able to measure around the entire roundabout, all of the crosswalks. By the way, all of this was automated, by the way, by the full pipeline. This is an example from Bed-Stuy. You can see just like the levels of coverage that we have here. Basically, every single intersection has been reported almost accurately. And when we do this across all 100 cities, we can actually start to like draw correlations and do really cool like data science with like the distributions that we get across these different cities. So here's like a nationwide map of median pedestrian crossing distance. And like, I'm sure a lot of you can notice some similarities here in the Southwest, where a lot of these cities have really, really wide streets, like Glendale, like the Phoenix metro area, the LA metro area is a lot of SoCal. But also, strangely, one thing that surprised us when we were doing this was a lot of the Rust Belt has some of the shortest crossing distances in the United States. And we were really wondering, like, why is that? And it turns out the answer has to do with history. A lot of these Rust Belt cities were primarily home to streetcars, and streetcar streets are very narrow usually. What we ended up finding was that if you correlate the year of incorporation with the median crossing distance available, you can see a very clear linear upwards trend that as suburbanization happened, as newer cities were created in an era where cars already existed, their streets were designed to be wider than other streets, versus older cities typically had the narrower streets because they were designed around human scale and pedestrianization. Another really cool thing is we can see some correlations with regions. So we can see, for example, like the West Coast and Mountain West region tend to have slightly larger crosswalks than like the Northeast and the Rust Belt. I think the most impressive maps that we've made of this so far are some of the nation or the city-wide maps that we could put together. So these are maps of, like, for example, Milwaukee and Austin, where the lighter the color is, we can see longer crosswalks. And this is sort of where you can kind of go from like looking at a 10,000 foot level to looking at a very like 20-foot level. In Austin, for example, we can see that its downtown actually has really wide streets. This is kind of breaking in trends from other cities where the downtown is typically older and has narrower streets. For example, in Manhattan. Another thing that we noticed in Austin was there's a lot of new development suburbs, as you can see, that kind of cluster around the suburbs and the outskirts of Austin. These new development suburbs are actually surprisingly dense. They have really short crosswalk distances, and that might signal a reversal of this trend in recent years. Milwaukee, on the other hand, has a very similar pattern to Chicago, which I'll show in the next slide, where you can see these like sort of arterial lanes coming out of Milwaukee, which have really long crosswalk distances. And going back to that example that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk of people feeling that they're trapped in by arterial roads, like they're sort of locked in this like car-centric jail that surrounds them, even if they live in a walkable neighborhood, you can kind of see those jail cells here now. You can see what they look like. You can see the lines that separate them. Here's an example from Chicago and New York. So like I said, Chicago kind of looks a lot like Milwaukee. They're in similar regions. That kind of makes sense. You can also see the same arterial lines kind of go out of Chicago from the downtown. The area around the loop, remember Chicago is a really old city. Chicago tends to have really narrow, smaller crosswalks, especially in like the south side. You can see over there. New York, I think, was probably our highest coverage example that we could find. So in New York, I think this doesn't really surprise anyone, but you can, again, kind of see like along certain major corridors, there's longer crosswalk distances. And in very, very dense areas like central Brooklyn, for example, you find the narrow ones, the really narrow crosswalks. So this is primarily just a data set. When we published a paper on this, it was primarily just to show that this is what could be done. But there's a lot of work that can happen now that this data set exists. One of the things that I'm really excited about is correlating this to public health outcomes, things like pedestrian accidents, crash outcomes. Another thing would be to get better OpenStreetMap reporting. We are fundamentally constrained by the crosswalks that are reported on OpenStreetMap, which tend to be in highly dense, typically more liberal areas. Like people you can imagine in this room who would actually sit down and contribute to OpenStreetMap are the ones, that's the data set that we have to work with. A lot of like areas in, for example, the Deep South, they don't have high reporting. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. And so, as soon as we get higher reporting or a way to get higher reporting, we can probably rerun all of this. There's also better models. I mean, we used SAM2 when this paper was released. Now they're on to SAM3, which is much, much better. And I assume we'll probably get much better segmentation out of it. And lastly, more cities. All the code from this project is pretty reproducible. You can find it on my GitHub at, like, the repo is called Crossing Distances. You can pull it down, use your own modal account, run everything from like the training to the inference to the actual like algorithm to map the crosswalks themselves. You can all run that yourself. And we'd love to see people take this and do it on their own hometown or on their own cities, and really like expand the size of this data set. We are in the process of taking our existing crosswalks and uploading them to NYU's data repository. Once that's available, we'll be able to, publicize that out to other researchers so that they can work with that data set. And lastly, I'll leave, I think I started this talk on a little bit of a grim note on like how many people are being killed by this really bad trend. I'll leave it on kind of a better note now. The stat that I showed was from 2022. In the ensuing 4 years, we've actually seen somewhat of a decrease in traffic fatalities. I think people are sort of realizing that this is a trend that needs to be stopped. As we've actually seen them go down by almost 10% in just the last year. Even just in our own backyard, like we've seen here in Brooklyn, the Linden Boulevard redesign was announced last week. This took Linden Boulevard from looking like one of those images that I showed at the beginning of this talk at the top right over there. It's just like this huge, very intimidating looking crosswalk to this proposed redesign on the lower right, which you can see has refuge islands, it has bus lanes, it has places for you to stop and take a break when you're crossing the street. And this is the kind of design we'd love to see more of. I also mentioned that we published a paper on this. It's out at the Journal of Transport and Land Use. This paper got released in January. It has a lot more details on like the methodology design of this report, as well as some details on like correlations that we did with the data after we had it. Yeah, with that, I'll leave you all. Thank you for listening. These are my links, and happy to take any questions.
Hi, nice presentation. I lived in San Diego. I've lived in Philadelphia, so it was very interesting to see when you had those up there. Three things. One, was any consideration about overpasses? Two, Columbus Circle. Three, San Diego has lots of canyons that make a lot of irregular street things. Was there any issues you had with that irregular canyoning in San Diego?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. I'll address them in order. So I think your first one was on overpasses. Yes, those did pose a pretty big limitation. We realized like pretty early on that a lot of the tiles we were getting back were just of highways, where underneath it was actually a crosswalk. So that is a limitation we cite in the paper, that like we're not able to do inference on places that are covered by overpasses. It ends up being a vast minority of the data set, like less than 0.1%, I think. And so we were okay with just like stripping that out of our data set. As for Columbus Circle, I have not looked personally at the Columbus Circle tiles yet, but my assumption is that it probably looks pretty good. I think the main issue with Columbus Circle is probably a little bit of the tree cover that's around it. And from what I've seen in other examples from other cities, the model does pretty well at like looking behind trees and actually measuring crosswalks behind trees.
Right, but the thing about Columbus Circle and places like Grand Army Plaza, like, is that it's not just that the streets that surround it have those crosses, but they have crosses into and out of as well.
Yeah.
So that's what I was just wondering about.
Right. So I think with Columbus Circle, those are reported on OpenStreetMap, which means that we have the actual vectors for those crossings. And provided we have the vectors for those crossings and we segmented Columbus Circle correctly, the measurements should be accurate. Yeah. Your last question was on San Diego's canyons. I actually also went to school in San Diego, and so I know a little bit about this. I feel like San Diego's canyons are typically covered in interstates and freeways. And so I think a lot of the stuff that's inside the canyons of San Diego is like typically not crossable anyways. It's like an interstate. You're right, there are like a few, like Balboa, for example.
No. I mean, I'm a complete pedestrian. I lived there for 5 years as a pedestrian.
Yeah.
And the thing is that these canyons are in neighborhoods, from neighborhood to neighborhood. They're not highwayed.
Yes.
So they're the boundaries of the neighborhoods, but the streets go right up to them.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. There's like some arterials which do go inside the canyons. Again, those don't really pose a problem for our specific methodology because we focus on reported crossings and just segmenting from the top down. This is a good opportunity to highlight like one major limitation we found, which is when you look at satellite imagery, you often assume it's being taken from the top down sometimes. And that's reality, that's just not true because of the way that satellites orbit. Sometimes your images are not orthonormal. So they're like taken at an angle. So like one thing we noticed, this happened a lot in New York, was you have a lot of tall buildings, and the satellite image is taken from the side. And so the building blocks the street that it's being taken on. We had to actually fine tune our model on these instances. So the model is able to recognize when it's looking at a non-orthonormal image. And again, like look past the building or look past the canyon. And so I assume like one of the big issues with the canyons was if it's deep enough and we have a non-orthonormal image, we'd actually be hiding part of the crosswalk. But again, we're able to get around that with some careful fine tuning. Thanks.
Yeah. Was there an inciting incident that made you choose the subject for this project? Or are you just, why did you choose crosswalks?
I mean, I think the inciting incident is something that we've all to some degree faced. Like, I think all of us have, I mean, like I was not born in New York. I grew up in the Bay Area, and oftentimes like just crossing arterial roads is just really, really intimidating, right? Especially if you're really young, especially if you're really old. I think to a large degree, I think all of us have kind of faced that inciting incident where like you just come at a crosswalk and you're like, oh man, I didn't realize it was this long, you know? That happens a lot. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question is, did you try to measure like sort of the coverage of OpenStreetMap at all? Like, did you consider like, are all of the crosswalks being captured there?
Yeah, we did do some work on this. We definitely noticed some discrepancies. So like you find this a lot in rural cities, San Antonio was a big one. Omaha was another one. Where what tends to happen is because, like I mentioned, OpenStreetMap is contributor driven. Contributors will typically report crossings next to where they live. And so in the case of Omaha, for example, there's like 3 contributors who did all of the crosswalks for Omaha, and they only did their own neighborhoods, which sucks. It's like one of them did this one suburb in the Northwest, one of them did this one suburb in the Northeast, another one did like parts of downtown. And also sometimes they actually would I think they might have known each other because they traveled to each other's suburbs and redid each other's crosswalks sometimes. So I don't know what's going on there, what the deal is. But yes, you're right. That is like a big issue. We did some I think the extent of our exploration on this was just looking at the maps and realizing that, for example, there's like some big gaps in the coverage. But like I said, this is mostly in like semi-suburban rural areas.
But you didn't come up with like this percent of crosswalks are actually there.
We did not.
Okay.
To a large degree, though, that's hard to automate because that requires you to like go down to the street level and find where there's a crosswalk.
I guess well, sort of my thought was like, you have the images.
Yeah.
And you've trained a model on segmentation.
Yeah.
But you didn't train a model on crosswalks.
Yes.
Is there a crosswalk in this image?
So the reason why we didn't do this, we actually highlight this limitation in the paper. And because a lot of prior art exists in like just identifying the location of crosswalks. The problem is there are more ways to represent a crosswalk in a satellite image than there are to represent them in OpenStreetMap. And oftentimes there's like really interesting legal stuff. Like for example, I think a lot of us have seen these intersections where the crosswalk only exists on 3 sides of the intersection, but not the 4th side, even though there is like a stop line marking on the 4th side. And that's interesting because if you go to other cities, like this example from San Diego, this one, these stop lines, in some cities, these represent crossings, in some cities, these don't, right? And so there's really like strong city by city inconsistencies there where the only way to truly know if it's like legal to cross in a specific area is if someone has sat down and told us that, yeah, it's legal to cross in that specific area. It's hard to just look at like satellite imagery and be like, yeah, that's a crossing. There's clues, yes, like curb cuts, for example, but there's no like easy way to go about and do this for all cities.
Thank you for the presentation. It was quite impressive. I was just curious what the timeline of the project was, like how long do you guys work on it, if there were any pauses or something like that? And secondly, about how you briefly mentioned that the date of incorporation is something that like kind of says the story. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that the pedestrian experience in Detroit is like materially better than like New York City, but like there's this confounding factor of like when it was incorporated or like the streetcar history or something like that. Did you ever consider like how like city lines work and like the history of how maybe like annexation of suburbs or like how all these weird city lines in the US make the story a certain way where like maybe a suburb just like left or like was not a part of the city, even though it like there's a part of the city that's like around the suburb or something like that. Like maybe that says something about the data.
Yeah. And there's definitely a lot of examples for that, but I'll address your first question first about like the timeline of the project. We started working on this, I believe in September 2024. Yeah. And the paper was published in January 2026. I think most of the technical work for this project was done by mid 2025. The rest of it was just like paper writing, getting edits, peer review, etc. As for the, sorry, what was your second question? About
like some of these cities, how they're like so weird purely because of like history and politics. Like some, like New York City is mostly kind of coherent because of the like 5 boroughs just joining the city. But like a lot of places like Dallas or like Atlanta or like these places are like historically like a certain way. Maybe like there's a part of the city that makes it like look worse on average. Or maybe there's a part of the city that like does not connect to the city, but it's like a part that like is really integrated, even
Yes.
though it's not in the city lines.
Yeah. So for the large part, we stuck with I feel like I'm going to get a lot of pushback for this. We stuck with the Wikipedia consensus for what a city is. So like, but essentially to determine what we were looking at, we looked at the top 100 list of cities on Wikipedia. There are, you might notice, like many entries from the same metro area. You mentioned Dallas, right? So Dallas is one entry, Fort Worth is another entry, Irving is another entry, Plano is a fourth entry, and then Frisco is a fifth entry. They're all in the same metro area, but they're all independent cities. And so they each get their own measurement there. My understanding of how Wikipedia does that, like distinction of what's a city and what's not, or like what should be merged, has to do with like more governmental reasons. Like, does the city have its own independent government? Does it not? Et cetera, like that. That said, there are some examples where you can put like twin cities together. So like Minneapolis or St. Paul or Denver and Aurora or Philadelphia and Camden, for example. And you can see like pretty strong differences in the crossing distances across those two things, especially when there are state lines involved. So like in the Philly and Camden example, for example, Camden is in New Jersey, Philly's in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has really short crossings. Camden has really long crossings, right? You tend to see this in the case of like Denver and Aurora. Actually, Aurora has slightly shorter crossings than Denver itself does. But again, there's like, this needs further analysis, definitely. And we're hopeful that like when we publish the data set, there's folks, maybe you, who could do this analysis.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you think that it would be a good idea to potentially take the data that you have with that you took from, like, you took the OSM data, improved it in some way, and try to feed it back into OSM?
Yeah, we have explored that. Unfortunately, OSM is very against automated measurements going into OSM. This is in part because I think there were a few incidents in recent years where people tried to do something similar, but it had really bad accuracy and they just kind of like flooded OSM with total slop. So they have put down some rules about that. I think there's like a high degree of moderation. There's a path forward to do that where like you have to essentially get everything validated and moderated by a human. But there's no way to just like go in and do a bulk upload of everything we have. Yeah, also that.
Couple questions. One, did you look at any international cities? Two, did you consider using like winter imagery that doesn't have as much tree cover?
Yeah.
Sorry, did you consider winter satellite imagery that doesn't have as much tree cover?
Yeah.
And then in New York, jaywalking is legal now.
Yeah.
Did you look at like crossings that are just unmarked anywhere, like just street width in general?
Yeah. Again, so 3 questions. So on the international cities thing, yeah, so we scoped it to just the US just to keep things like reasonable with the cost and time constraints that we had. That said, the paper that this was based off of, the one where my collaborators went and like manually looked at cities, they did SF, Irvine, and Paris. So Paris was involved in that. We do eventually want to run this pipeline on cities that have high reporting, like Paris and Tokyo potentially. But one of the big restrictions there is, of course, OSM reporting tends to be more sparse outside of North America. So that is a big like limiting factor here. Sorry, remind me again, what were your second 2 questions? Tree cover. Yes, on the tree cover side. So this is, again, something we outlined in the paper about how we could just use winter to get around it. This, of course, doesn't work in some cities. Like Seattle has a lot of evergreen trees. And so you can't really do that in places like Seattle. But yes, that is something we could do. The constraint that we couldn't do it here is because we're using Google Maps tile server, and Google Maps doesn't let us pick like what season we want to use. So some places it is actually winter, and that's great for us. Some places like New York, it's summertime. So that's not as good. Yeah. And then, sorry, last question.
Jaywalking.
Jaywalking, yes. Again, that's like, we focused mainly on like reported crossings on OpenStreetMap. I think also like California now has that rule where you can just kind of jaywalk provided there's no traffic. We would love to see someone take this data and extrapolate it out to street width, because I think that is something you definitely could do. The main problem is a lot of jaywalking like research, it's not super actionable, right? Because like when we're looking at pedestrian fatalities, we typically look at places where we can make a meaningful difference. Like we can add a bulb out, or we can add like a refuge island or something like that. It's hard to say like, because someone jaywalked in this area, like we need to make some sort of actionable change to the street design there. Unless we have some usage metric of like, okay, there's a lot of people jaywalking on this particular corridor. something like that, which I'm sure exists. Just we need to find it. Yeah.
It's very hard to. Aspects. Built environment.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because oftentimes in the police report, you'll try to see like where the victim fell. Sometimes that's not entirely accurate. So, yeah.
Perhaps I missed it, but did you ever look for a correlation between the length of the crossings and the number of pedestrian deaths in the cities?
Not with this version of
Okay.
the study. We'd love to see someone do that though. The main goal here is to like get the data set out there. And there's like 101 different things that we can do with this data set, one of which is pedestrian fatality measurements. We'd love to see that. I know the paper before this, my collaborators did do that work where they took the hand designed ones from like SF Irvine in Paris, and they did look at crash ratings, and they found that like, for example, in Irvine, I think the like median crossing distance of the intersections that had pedestrian fatalities was much higher than the ones without.
Awesome.
Yeah.
At the beginning, I think you alluded to something with Jacksonville and like low resolution. I'm curious if you have anything interesting to share there.
Yeah, we spent a very limited amount of time looking into it. All I can get at is Jacksonville just doesn't have doesn't have low zoom level satellite imagery for whatever reason. I think another thing is, I mean, maybe this is a lot of Florida hate, but I think Florida doesn't really have sidewalks. And I don't know, like it also presents as like pretty low resolution sometimes. Even if you look at like really low zoom levels on Google Maps, sometimes you go to Jacksonville, it just kind of looks really blurry because you're not actually looking at a sidewalk. You're looking at like the vegetation that is the side of the road. Yeah. Sorry to anyone here who lives in Florida.
Okay.
On the subject of zoom levels, did you find that like there was a certain level beyond which the segmentation worked a lot better in terms of resolution, or did you play around with that at all?
It was less from like the after which zoom level did segmentation work better, and more like at which zoom level did it just stop working entirely? My answer was 19. After 19, it just kind of, it's too low resolution. I think like every pixel at zoom level 18 is actually like 5 meters on the ground or something. And so that's too low to make any meaningful inferences about, because your baseline error will always be at least 5 meters.
But above that, it worked pretty much as low as you could get.
Yeah, I don't think we tried lower than 21. Like, I think 22 is pretty hard to find sometimes. And like, I think 23 is the lowest you go before you eventually just like swoop down into street level Google Maps. Yeah.
All right.
I got one more. In terms of image compression, were there any sort of things that were difficult to compress in the images that caused problems when you were down-resing or not down-resing, but yeah, compressing the images?
Surprisingly, no. That's a good question. We kind of just use, I think, I'm trying to remember I think we just use like a very basic like PNG compression algorithm, and it was kind of fine. I think really the bigger problem is that the Google Maps tile server stores images way larger than they actually have to be. It's 150 megs per image at the zoom level 21. That's way too high. No one's going to need that. I'm sure they have some reason to store it at that level, but yeah, we can bring it down to like 3 megs really pretty easily with little to no compression. And like if you look into like what actually happens when you do compression in images, you can, in most cases, get like 99% space savings with like imperceptible changes in vision quality. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.